A stone pulled from tree roots on a Minnesota farm was a 500-year-old message that could blow up one of history's biggest claims. Everyone learned that Columbus discovered America. This stone says that story came 130 years too late. Within weeks, linguists called it a fraud. The Smithsonian spent years going back and forth. Olaf Oman, the farmer who found it, refused money, used it as a doorstep, and died saying it was real. That was in 1898, outside Kensington, Minnesota. Years later, a modern scientist tested it again, and the results should not have been possible. The stone was found on Oman's own land, while stumps were being cleared that fall to make room for crops. It lay face down in the dirt, tangled in the roots of a small poplar tree. His 10-year-old son, Edward, noticed the marks first. Strange, sharp symbols had been cut in neat rows across the face of the stone. Oman guessed it might be some kind of Indian almanac. He had no idea what he was really holding. Even the date of the discovery is not fully settled. Some early reports say August. Others say November. No outsider ever saw the tree still standing and still growing. By the time anyone from outside the farm arrived, only a stump, a hole, and a story were left. That gap matters. Months passed before any independent witness saw the site intact. And that is the kind of thing investigators keep coming back to. If the stone was real, then Oman was holding a message from a Norse trip that had gone deep into North America a century before any European was supposed to be anywhere near Minnesota. The inscription, written in a mix of runes and Latin numbers, told of 8 Goths or Scandinavians, possibly from Gotaland or Gotland, and 22 Norwegians traveling west from Vinland. It spoke of a camp by 2 skerries, a fishing trip, and a return to find 10 men red with blood and dead. It ended with a prayer, AVM, or Ave Maria, save us from evil, and said 10 more men had been left behind to guard the ships, 14 days away from a stone. The numbers were carved in an old dot-and line counting style, which made the whole thing feel even older. If that story was true, it would rewrite the discovery of America. Word spread fast. A neighbor, Niels Flatton, came to see it that same day and later swore under oath that the find was real. The stone was taken into town, set in a bank window, copied by hand, and mailed to scholars at the University of Minnesota. That is where the first crack appeared. Almost at once, Professor Olaus Breda studied the copied inscription and gave his answer within weeks in the university's student paper. The grammar was wrong, not a little wrong. Wrong in a way that sounded like someone writing in modern Scandinavian languages, not medieval ones. He sent copies to top scholars in Norway, Sweden, and Denmark. Their answer was the same: fraud. A modern fake dressed up like a relic from the 1300s. By early 1899, the case looked closed. Except no one really closed it. The stone went back to Oman's farm. And what happened next should have ended the debate one way or the other. Instead, it made everything stranger. Oman did not show it off, like treasure. He did not sell it, even though people offered money. He turned it face down and used it as a step by his granary door. For years, farm tools rolled over it, and boots scraped across the carved side every morning. If he had spent months faking a world-shaking discovery, he was treating it like trash. That alone tells you something is off. But it cuts both ways, and that is the trap. A hoaxer who hides a stone in plain sight and uses it as a doorstep is either deeply confident or deeply careless about something he never understood. To understand what may have happened, you have to look at who Olaf Oman really was. He was not just a farmer. He was a Swedish immigrant with a simple country education from a time and place where runes were still taught in rural schools back home. He owned books, real books on a real shelf, that later historians listed one by one. One was a popular Swedish school manual with a chapter on language history. Another was a history of Sweden by the scholar Oscar Montelius. And inside one of them was a medieval prayer ending almost word for word like the line carved on the stone. He also had a friend named Sven Fogelblad, a defrocked pastor and traveling schoolmaster. That friend owned an old Swedish grammar book, reportedly knew runes, and reportedly disliked university men who looked down on immigrant farmers like him and Oman. Motive, chance, and materials. That is not proof. No one ever confessed. But it is the kind of link that makes investigators uneasy, and it should make you uneasy too. Then there is the tree. In 1910, investigators tried to use it like a natural clock. They wanted to count its rings and guess how long the stone had been buried under the roots. But witnesses gave wildly different numbers. Some said the tree looked 10 or 12 years old. Others insisted it was 30 or 40. No one had actually studied the tree while it was still standing. They only looked at a stump and a whole months later, after the place had already been disturbed. A detail that should have solved the mystery only made it deeper. Then, years later, the Smithsonian Institution put the stone on public display in 1948. Newspapers called it one of the most important archaeological finds in North America. It looked like proof at last. It was not. That support came from one Smithsonian official giving a personal opinion, not from a formal ruling by the institution. 7 years later, the museum quietly sided with a Danish scholar who said the inscription was not medieval at all. The prestige had been borrowed. No one made much noise when it was taken back. So by the middle of the 1900s, the rune stone sat in a strange kind of limbo. Scholars who studied its language rejected it. The public, who wanted it to be real, half celebrated it. And that might have been where the story stayed, a quiet local oddity, if not for one thing. The stone kept traveling. In 1965, it stood on display at the New York World's Fair before crowds who had never heard of Kensington, Minnesota. Years later, it made the reverse trip across the Atlantic for exhibits in Stockholm and in Hudiksvall, in the same part of Sweden where Oman's family had come from. A 202-pound slab of carved gray stone, once used as a farm step, ended up under museum lights on 2 continents. Wherever it went, people came to stare. Scholars kept saying the same thing, and still nobody stopped looking. In 1910, the Minnesota Historical Society ran its own investigation and brought in outside experts to settle the matter for good. Linguist George Flom studied the inscription line by line and confirmed what the European scholars had already said. The grammar belonged to the modern age, not the 1300s. Case closed, everyone thought. Except one investigator did not agree. Newton Winchell, the state's top geologist, looked past the words and studied the stone itself. He argued that the weathering inside the carved grooves looked far too advanced for something cut in 1898. He guessed centuries, not decades. It was a strange, lonely opinion buried inside a report that was otherwise nearly united. And it planted a seed that would not die. But there is one detail in Winchell's report that rarely gets repeated. Before he ever measured anything, he wrote down his first reaction to the carving. It looked fresh, recent, almost too clean. Then he talked himself out of that feeling after he started measuring the depth of the weathering, and he published the opposite conclusion. He never fully explained what changed his mind. The man who ended up defending the stone had first seen it just like everyone else, until he decided not to trust what he saw. That seed stayed quiet for almost 100 years. Then, in the 2000s, a forensic geologist named Scott Walter picked the stone back up, this time under a microscope. Walter studied a mineral called biotite mica, which breaks down and flakes off stone surfaces over time at a measurable rate. He compared the mica loss in the runestone's carved grooves to mica loss on tombstones in Maine, stones with known ages going back about 200 years. His finding was simple. On those 200-year-old tombstones, the mica was only starting to flake away. On the runestone carvings, the mica was already gone. By his math, that meant the runestone had been weathering for centuries, not since 1898. If Walter was right, then an object dismissed by linguists as an obvious fake was, geologically, exactly as old as it claimed to be. For a moment, the impossible looked possible again. And that idea spread fast. A cable TV series built around Walter's investigations ran for years and introduced millions of people to the runestone as if the science were settled, long before peer reviewers had checked his numbers. Around the same time, a Texas researcher named Richard Nielsen pushed the case even further. He was not a trained linguist. He was an engineer who had studied the inscription for decades. He argued that one rune, marked with an unusual matched forms found on real medieval stones from Gotland. If he was right, then the language was not modern at all. It had just been read the wrong way. That claim reached someone who could really test it. Henrik Williams, a professor of rhunology at Uppsala University in Sweden, was one of the very few scholars alive with the training to settle a question like this. He took the dotted runes seriously enough to inspect the stone himself in Stockholm. He spent years writing back and forth with Nielsen and Walter about it. This was not a quick dismissal. This was a real scholar giving a fringe idea a real chance to survive contact with expertise. It did not survive. Williams later wrote in his own published study that he could not find another medieval Scandinavian text that looked anything like the Kensington inscription. The grammar, the missing word endings, the vocabulary, all of it pointed in the same old direction. Still, the theory had been tested by exactly the kind of person who could have proved it right. That mattered. It showed that the case against the stone was not built on academic snobbery. It was built on someone truly trying and failing to make the impossible version true. Then came the answer that finished off the geology case. And it came from inside the same field. Geologist Harold Edwards, who had once worked with Walter, published a peer-reviewed breakdown that took the mica argument apart piece by piece. First problem. The runestone is not even made from local rock. The glacial soil around Kensington does not produce this kind of greywacke. The slab looks like imported stone, the kind quarried and sold in the eastern United States in the 1800s. Second problem, measure the runes themselves, and they fall almost exactly on the United States inch, a unit standardized in 1866. Not a medieval Scandinavian measure at all. The third problem was the worst. Some of the runes were cut into a thin coat of soft calcite on the stone. Calcite weathers fast, faster than the rock under it. If those runes had been exposed or buried for more than 500 years, that calcite should have shown heavy wear. It did not. In Edwards's own analysis, the letters looked almost as sharp as the day they were cut. Another geologist, Michael Miklovic, pointed out a different flaw in the original tombstone comparison. It depended on only a few samples from a completely different region, with different minerals, a different climate, and different exposure. That is not the kind of match you want when you are trying to prove something this extraordinary. The reversal collapsed. And it was not the only time of medieval Minnesota. Runestone fell apart when tested. In 2001, a second carved boulder appeared near the first discovery site. For a moment, it seemed to support the original stone. Then it came out that university graduate students had carved it years earlier as a private joke and never thought anyone would take it seriously. Walter had studied that one too before the prank was exposed. The parallel is hard to miss. Even today, with modern tools, experts can still be fooled by a rock and a chisel. But the real blow to the runestone did not come from a joke. It came from an old notebook. In the early 2000s, researchers linked the stone's strange, non-standard runic alphabet to a document called the Larson Papers. It was a notebook kept by a Swedish tailor in the 1880s, listing rune forms that matched the Kensington inscription almost letter for letter. Later research traced that notebook to a parish region with a direct family link to Olaf Oman himself. A cousin lived in the same small district where those exact runes had already appeared on other inscriptions decades before Oman ever came to Minnesota. This was not myth, not rumor. It was a real dated physical document that tied the exact alphabet on the medieval Minnesota stone to a village in Sweden, decades after Oman had already left for America, and centuries after any Viking could have carved it. That should have been the final nail. For most professional rhunologists today, it basically is. But notice what that discovery really did to the story. It did not just show a hoax. It showed a specific hoax. A traceable one. An almost forensic one. One tied not to some unknown prankster, but to Oman's own community, his own family web, and his own cultural background. The impossible language was not impossible at all. It had just been hiding in the wrong century. Inside a small Swedish notebook nobody thought to check for more than 100 years. There is one more piece of testimony worth mentioning, mostly because it is so weak. In 1976, a recorded interview surfaced in which a man named Frank Walter Grant claimed his father had confessed years earlier to helping Oman carve the stone. A deathbed confession told secondhand. Never notarized. Never independently confirmed. Historians treat it as folklore, not evidence. It belongs here only because people still bring it up as if it settles the whole case. It does not. The real case against the stone was never built on a confession. It was built on grammar, geology, and a notebook from a Swedish village. Physical things. Checkable things. Much harder to undo than a story about what somebody's father supposedly said. Meanwhile, real Norse exploration in North America was being confirmed by totally different evidence. Thousands of miles away, archaeologists Helga Ingstad and Stein Ingstad had already identified a real Norse settlement at Lance Aux Meadows in Newfoundland in 1960. It was the first hard proof anywhere in North America that the sagas about a place called Vinland were not pure fiction. Then, in 2021, a new team pushed the dating even further. Using a method built around a solar radiation spike in the year 993, they dated wood cut with metal tools at that same site to the exact year 1021. Precise. Peer-reviewed. Published in Nature. Butternuts found there suggest Norse travelers went even farther south than the settlement itself. For once, this is evidence that does not need a courtroom speech to survive. Vikings really were here 340 years before the Kensington date, and about 1,500 miles away from Minnesota. Real evidence of Norse presence in America exists. It just does not come anywhere near Oman's farm. So where does that leave the runestone? Not innocent, but not simple either. Because here is the part people do not like saying out loud. Even now, a small number of credentialed researchers still argue that it is real, still challenge the geology, and still call the rebuttals biased. Some point to old Norwegian royal letters from the 1350s ordering an expedition to check on Norse colonists in the north who had gone silent. Real documents about a real mission that may never have sailed. That kind of half-true thread can keep a theory alive long after the physical evidence has moved on. It does not prove the wildest version of the story, but it does explain why even careful people keep circling back. The Stones Museum in Alexandria still displays it as the center of the town's identity, beneath a giant Viking statue over 60 feet tall that calls the town the birthplace of America. Minnesota's NFL team took its name from the same Scandinavian pride the stone helped stir. A television series built a whole audience by retelling Walter's theories, with some versions tying the stone to the Knights Templar long after most academic rhinologists thought the case was settled. The linguistics, the notebook, and the imported stone did the work no confession ever could. And still, the argument will not die. That may be the most troubling part of all. Not that a Minnesota farmer might have fooled the world for a short time in 1899, but that 130 years of geology, linguistics, and archive work still have not fully closed the file. Not in the public imagination. Not in the gift shops. Not on television specials, still airing years after peer review weighed in. For thousands of Scandinavian American families across the upper Midwest, the stone was never just a rock. It was proof that their ancestors got here first. Proof that the history books had left them out. That kind of hope does not vanish just because a geologist finds a flaw in the mica. Ask who benefits from either answer, and the story gets more uncomfortable, not less. A small museum built its whole identity and much of its tourism around this one object. A town built part of its pride on it. And an academic field in 1910 would have had to admit that a farmer with no formal training had come close to fooling the best-trained linguists in Scandinavia. That is not an easy thought for institutions built on the idea that expertise always wins. The stone is still there behind glass in Alexandria, Minnesota. Its label talks about a discovery. It does not fully capture the fight still swirling around it. Visitors lean in close, read the sharp, oddly modern-looking runes for themselves, and leave believing whatever they believed when they walked in. Somewhere in that small museum, a rock that science says was carved by a 19th century farmer is still doing exactly what it was made to do. Whether it was made by accident, as a prank, or by a man who died before he ever explained himself, It is still making people wonder if Columbus was wrong. The stone may be false, but the doubt it planted is still alive. Some stories survive every test. Subscribe so you don't miss the next one.